Okay, folks, today, if you look at your Google Classroom site, you've noticed that a few things have been posted. I want to make sure everybody's on the same page. There are a number of you that kind of fallen behind on some work, so I want to make sure you know exactly what needs to get done moving forward here. Some of you still haven't done the spring break assignments, the LEQ and the New Deal stuff. That's kind of on your own. And again, if you're taking the AP exam, that's going to be very vital for you for review purposes to go over those LEQs, because that literally is reviewing every topic that the AP test has utilized, at least for the free response questions, for the past like 40 years, all right? So please make sure you're looking through those, if not to do the assignment, at least to review for the actual test. I want to make sure you understand as well, the Zoom calls for the next 2 weeks, are for AP test takers only. So if you are either CCP or you have opted out of the AP test, you do not need to attend the Zoom. But if you are taking the AP exam, I expect you to be on the call for the next 2 weeks. All right? The in-person test, the paper and pencil test, is on the 6th. So you're talking about a week from Thursday. So you got 2 Zoom calls left before the actual test takes place. The actual digital in-person is not until the 19th. Okay, so for those of you taking digital in-person, you got some kind of cushion. And for those of you taking it at home, you got until early June. I can't remember exactly the exact date, but it's early June, or some of you will be taking it on the 19th if you're an at-home learner. So just kind of pay attention to your emails from the AP board moving forward. Anyway, just make sure you understand, if you're taking the AP test in any form, I do expect you on the Zoom calls for the next 2 days, or the next 2 Wednesdays. But if you are not, if you're CCP or you've opted out of the test, you are exempt. All right? All right, so a couple of things. The spring break assignments are due. Please make sure you get those done. I gave you an assignment over Truman versus Eisenhower. That was due yesterday. A few people have reached out for an extension on that. It was just as simple, and I had people getting confused. All you had to do was write a basic 1, maybe 2 sentence response where it's just telling me why those people, events, whatever else mattered to that president, okay, during the presidential administration of Truman or Eisenhower. So you're kind of comparing the two without directly comparing them, if you will, okay? I gave you 2 presentations, the modern U.S. history presentation and the Cold War beginning presentation. They're about an hour in length each. That's kind of going through all the time period of the basically second half of the 20th century. So you're talking about basically the Cold War from 1945 all the way up to 1990, okay? Then I have a couple of review activities, okay? Modern U.S. presidents right here, which is kind of going through, and this is an actual assignment that we're going to go through here in a second. Review material, which is the presidents of the United States. It's a YouTube video where I go from Washington all the way up to Trump, okay, technically to Biden, talking about all the presidents and what you should remember about their presidential administrations. So for those of you especially taking the AP exam, it's a good place to start to try and understand, all right, what happened during each person's presidency. Because if you get, let's say, an LEQ on James Madison, first thing that should pop into your mind is, all right, James Madison, he was the War of 1812. So at least you have that in the kind of background. He's the 4th president, War of 1812. I got that. James K. Polk, all right, he was, whatever president, he's the 11th president, but, if you can immediately say, all right, Polk was Mexican War, and he wanted to expand out to the West Coast. He's the one that brought in California. He's the one that kind of, made us see the shining sea, brought in Oregon as well. If you can just remember those little things about each one of the presidents, then the AP exam becomes just a tad easier, because you're at least kind of, categorizing things. So if you're going to memorize anything before the AP exam, that's what you should probably memorize, okay, is the presidents and what they accomplished. There is an extra credit opportunity. You can take the quiz on the presidents, okay? The quiz on the presidents, it's a pretty simple, straightforward quiz, especially if you watch the review material, if you actually watch the YouTube video of all the presidents in order and take down some notes. That quiz should be very easy. So for those of you trying to recoup some points here and there, then that extra credit opportunity is there for you. It's due next week before the actual AP exam is administered, okay? Moving forward, after the AP exam is done, you will have a final project in the class before you kind of, sigh and give me all kinds of grief over the fact that you have to do work. Do realize that the end of the course project is more kind of discussion based. So for those of you in person, we can talk about these things and kind of help you out. For those of you remote, you can hop on Zoom calls, which by the way, for my in-person folks, after the AP exam, the first administration of the AP exam, Zoom calls are only going to be for remote learners. So you won't have to see my ugly mug on Wednesdays moving forward after the AP exam. So this is where you get excited, Nehemiah. I don't have to log on? All right, breakfast time. So while my in-person learners are getting breakfast here, a reminder, remote learners, moving forward after the AP exam, so after these next 2 remote learning days, next 2 Wednesdays, where AP test takers have to log on, the only people that need to log on after that are my remote learners, okay? So remote learners, I do expect you to hop on the Zoom calls for the last 2 Wednesdays in May, okay?
Can I say hi?
This is what I have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. For those of you at home, aren't you excited that you don't have to see Anna Banana and Osandom every single day?
No, we're both very kind and intelligent human beings. They love us.
I doubt it. All right, so for those of you that have your computers up into Google Classroom, go ahead and go to the Modern U.S. Presidents assignment. And you will notice it looks very similar to what you just did with Truman and Eisenhower. The only difference is I'm going to help you out here. Okay? So we're starting off with John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy. And here are the 10 words, phrases, people, events, whatever, that kind of go along with John F. Kennedy. You will notice the first term is inaugural address. What is an inaugural address?
Isn't it like when they feel like they're being sworn as president?
Okay, so they've just been sworn in as President of the United States. Okay, you are correct. It's the speech they give right after they swear to uphold the Constitution. Okay? Amongst many other things. Now, does anybody know why John F. Kennedy's inaugural address matters, or why it becomes historically relevant? Because not every president does. The only inaugurals that we have talked about really have been William Henry Harrison, because he died after it. All right? We don't even really care what he said. He spoke for 2 hours in a sleet storm and ended up getting pneumonia and died 31 days later. We cared about Abraham Lincoln, okay, because Lincoln was trying to kind of save the Union as the Civil War was starting. But yeah, we bring up John F. Kennedy. And we talk about FDR. FDR said the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, which is one of the dumbest statements in American history. And yet people are like, no, that's an important quote. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. If you think about it, it's a meaningless statement, but back in 1933 when he said it, people in the audience were like, yeah, absolutely. I see where he's going with that. Gives you an idea where the Depression was at by that point. When they took nonsense and went, yep, he understands. Okay? I'm of course being sarcastic, but John F. Kennedy, anybody know why his inaugural address matters? How about if I said, ask not what your country can do for you, what you can do for your country, and the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans. What does he mean by that? Okay, you've just gotten done doing research over Truman and Eisenhower. Describe Truman and Eisenhower. If you could describe them collectively, what's a word you would use to describe them? Anybody. Presidents, thank you, good. You met Truman on the street, and then afterwards I say, hey, describe him for me. Physically, what's one of the characteristics you would tell me? You meet these guys on the street. Old. That's the first word that comes to mind, right? Young. Torch. Past. New generation. What is he saying? Young people are what? In charge now. Old way of doing things is gone. I'm here. We're doing it different. He is the youngest president we ever elected. 43 years of age. Okay? John F. Kennedy. He's not the youngest president we ever had. Anybody remember the youngest president we ever had? Meaning he was not elected, but placed into office because of sad circumstances.
Teddy.
Very good. 10 points for Gryffindor. Teddy Roosevelt, 42 years of age. Okay? That's when McKinley got shot and Mark Hanna said, the damn cowboy's president. Okay? Which was quite literal because Teddy Roosevelt was a cowboy for a few years when he lost his dang mind. Okay? But John F. Kennedy comes in. He's the youngest elected president we ever had, and he's the first person that is not a WASP. Does anybody remember that term? Anybody know what WASP stands for? Let's take a guess here. Anybody got a word that starts with a W to describe someone? Weird. Okay, good. Think about it. Every president has had this in common prior to John F. Kennedy, and including John F. Kennedy. They're all white. They are all Anglo-Saxon, which means they are from Northern European stock, okay? Meaning they're German, they're English, they're Irish, that's where they're coming from. So white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, meaning they're Methodist, Baptist, Presbyterian, okay? Anglican. So they're all Christian. What's the other side of it? If you're not a Protestant yet still Christian, what are you? You are Catholic. And that is what sets Kennedy apart. He's your first minority president because he is a Catholic. Okay? Still white Anglo-Saxon, but he's Catholic. That was a big change. There were a lot of people worried that he was going to take orders from the Pope. Yes? What? Parties. Are you talking about when did the Democrats and Republicans kind of finish their swap? I think Nixon. From Johnson to Nixon. Vietnam swayed. It's not like there's one year where they just make the switch.
That's the second president to do it. At the time. What? That's like around the same time, right?
60s and 70s.
Okay. Thanks.
During the Civil Rights Movement.
Bye.
We will talk in class. I
Wait, can
promise.
I take my chair? I have one.
Here.
Please. Sorry, guys.
Sorry, guys.
High maintenance much?
Yeah?
For those of you at home, cash is high maintenance, but you know that. All right, so white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, okay?
I'm on my second.
Kennedy is the first one that is not. and there is a general concern by some people in the country that he is going to listen to the Pope first and the American people second, which is ridiculous, but that was the general tenor, okay? Now, of course, when we say he's the first minority president, is he really? No, but that's the best we can get, okay? President number 35 is the first one to be Catholic, okay? Needless to say, Kennedy comes in and kind of changes the game, all right? He's younger, he's got a young wife, young children. Jackie Kennedy captivates America. She comes in and immediately redoes a number of the rooms in the White House. She redecorates the White House, then invites the press to come in and take a look at what she's done, okay? Kind of introducing the American people. Most people in America are not going to see the interior of the White House. You know, they're never going to go to Washington. They're never going to go on the tour. So seeing it on TV was a big deal. So she almost kind of became an unofficial PR person for the Kennedy White House, okay? So this youth movement is a big deal during Kennedy's time. And the inaugural address kind of sets the tone. He sets it from the very beginning that the old way is not the way we're going to do it now, you know? And keep in mind, Truman and Eisenhower had started the Cold War. Kennedy's almost announcing that we're going to do it differently. We're not going to do it the same way. But, as with most politicians, what they say and what they do are completely different. Okay? That leads us to the Bay of Pigs invasion. And again, if you guys have this up, you literally can be typing this stuff as we're going along. This gives you at least a head start. Okay? So inaugural address starts off with basically an appeal to the young people of America. That the torch has been passed to you, and I'm going to be your torchbearer. I'm going to be the one that ushers you in as a new generation of Americans, okay? We are, and we're going to get to it here in a second, the new frontier, okay? It's kind of a flash forward here. But that's not to say he doesn't stumble, and one of his big stumbles is the Bay of Pigs invasion. Anybody know where the Bay of Pigs is? Or have you ever heard of this? Bay of Pigs is in Cuba. Anybody know what happened during the 1950s in Cuba that complicated our relationship?
Is that Castro?
Very good. Castro. Okay, and you are correct. Communists. They called it socialism, but it was darn close to communism. Okay? In 1954, Castro had a popular uprising against the United States-backed government, because remember, we had been in Cuba and been involved in Cuba ever since the Spanish-American War. When Cuba got their independence from Spain, they really didn't get their independence. We were still involved in the sugar trade. We were still involved in the tobacco trade. We were very much influencing the government of Cuba. You guys remember the term banana republic? Where we don't control it politically, but because of our economics, we tend to influence it to the point where we really do kind of have the control and the power. That was what Cuba was, okay? And no matter what the Platt Amendment said, no matter what happened in Cuba, we still kind of dominated the island. In 1954, Castro and his followers basically say, we're done. We're no longer okay with that, okay? And I don't know if you guys have ever noticed in pop culture here, has anybody ever seen Che Guevara, this image on t-shirts? Okay, Che Guevara is a freedom fighter in his own belief structure. He kind of believes himself to be a freedom fighter. You'll see this image at a lot of protest rallies, especially if it's a protest over immigration or if it's a protest over U.S. domination in some way, shape, or form. Because this guy fights alongside Castro amongst many other Latin American countries against American involvement in their business and in their politics. Okay? So Castro comes to power because of people like this that become freedom fighters against the United States. So this image has become an anti-United States image. It's kind of, if you wear a t-shirt with Che Guevara, you're pretty much saying you're against the government, you're against American foreign policy. You know, that's what it stands for. Some people wear this and not really understand what it is. This image was made popular by bands like Rage Against the Machine during the 1990s, which was a band that was totally against American government foreign policy and totally against a lot of the, day-to-day policy within the United States. And look, I'm not trying to sell them short. That if I don't know if you guys have ever even heard of Rage Against the Machine because it was a little before your time, but their music tends to be very politically motivated. Okay. And look, these guys were singing about police brutality back in the 1990s before it became kind of a huge, Black Lives Matter issue, if you will. So they were kind of on the forefront of what eventually would become the Black Lives Matter movement. But all of that, again, stems from this revolutionary imagery, okay? But the Bay of Pigs invasion was Kennedy's plan to remove Castro, okay? This was basically cooked up by the CIA. When Castro took power from the United States-backed government, a lot of Cubans, especially Cubans in the high levels of the sugar trade, high levels of the tobacco trade, they escaped because they realized that they were probably either going to be imprisoned or tortured or whatever else by the Castro regime. So they skipped out. They went to Miami, Florida. Okay, so if you go to Miami, Florida, there are a lot of Cubans. Okay, a lot of Cuban people in Miami, Florida. Okay, and just Florida in general, quite honestly. And they're still coming over. Like, there are still immigrants coming over illegally from Cuba. Now, when Castro took over, we really didn't like Castro. We wanted to get rid of him. And the CIA cooked up this plan that they were going to train these Cuban freedom fighters. That they were going to train these people and then drop them off in Cuba to do an insurrection against Castro, very similar to the way he took over in the first place in the 1950s. So the CIA trains these people. We drop them off in a place called the Bay of Pigs. The problem is it's one of the worst kept secrets in America at that point that's what we're doing. Castro's ready for it, and so his entire military kind of wipes them out, captures them, and then we can't really help them. So it ends up being a huge black eye on John F. Kennedy's presidency. Okay, one of the worst decisions he would make, and one of the worst decisions during the Cold War. Okay, it basically blows up in our face. Okay, and so it basically is a resounding victory for Castro and his regime, and the people that are backing him up. Now, this is a precursor to the most tense 13 days in modern American history, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, Cuban Missile Crisis comes along the next year in 1962 because the Cubans are emboldened to get closer to their Soviet allies. The Soviet Union decides to put nuclear missiles in Cuba aimed at the United States. Okay? So they aim these missiles at the United States. They're going to take out cities like Washington, D.C. They're going to take out New York City. As a favor to Castro, they're going to take out Miami, Florida, because that's where all of his opponents live. And by the way, number 4 on the list is Dayton, Ohio. Very rarely you're going to see a list that go Washington, New York, Miami, Dayton. Anybody know why Dayton? Some of you have been there before. There's an important distinction about Dayton, Ohio. Ever heard of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base? You guys have never been up to the museum up there?
Like the airplane museum?
Yeah, the Air Force Museum.
Oh.
That's on Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Okay, largest military installation with the most planes at that time especially. That was, if we got into a war, that was going to be where our response was coming from. Folks, when we were bombing Iraq back during the early 2000s, most of the flights were taking off from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base to then get the arms, ammunition, necessities of our European installations to then go over and fight the war on terror. So Wright-Patterson Air Force Base is a key stop on the pipeline of our military-industrial complex. Okay, so they were going to take out Dayton, Ohio, so they took out our Air Force. On a side note, if you've never been up to the National Air and Space Museum, like the Air Force Museum up there, you really need to go. It's free. okay? It's literally 6 airplane hangars of every type of plane, from the very early planes of Wilbur and Orville Wright, who were originally from Dayton, Ohio. They were bicycle shop owners who got into aviation, created the first flight, okay? So they've got the first contraptions ever used to fly, all the way up to the newest and best in aviation. They have a stealth bomber up there. They've got all these different planes. They've got a lot of presidential planes too. You can walk on Air Force Ones, okay? And it's pretty cool to do that. And again, it's all free. So if you ever get a chance to go up there, I would strongly advise you to do so. Okay, it's even if you're not really a history person, it's pretty cool to walk through the planes. Okay, take my daughters up there. Prior to COVID, we used to go up there fairly regularly. They loved walking around, especially climbing through kind of the bellies of some of those planes. They also have a replica of a space shuttle up there. So if you always wanted to see kind of what the astronauts are doing, you can walk through that as well. There are all kinds of cool displays. I digress. Cuban Missile Crisis, though, was a 13-day standoff where the Soviet Union put nuclear weapons in Cuba and aimed them at the United States. Okay? Kennedy has a basic stare down with the leader of the Soviet Union at the time, and we're going to skip down, a guy named Nikita Khrushchev. Nikita Khrushchev was the leader of the Soviet Union after Stalin. When Stalin dies in the early 1950s, Khrushchev takes over. Khrushchev is a hard-line communist. Okay, he is the one that's going to fuel most of the furor here. He was a World War II general. He really doesn't like the United States all that much. Doesn't trust us. We didn't trust him. So when he comes into power, with Stalin we felt like we could at least work with him. With Khrushchev, not so much. Okay, Khrushchev was a hard-line communist. He proves it by coming over to the United Nations to give a speech. And where is the United Nations? Where are they located at? Not in Great Britain. It's in New York City. You ever go to New York City, the United Nations is stationed there. It's on the Hudson River, okay? It's a massive building. Another cool place to go. If you ever go to New York City, you should go to the United Nations. It's a great tour, and I mean, it's a really interesting complex. But in the General Assembly, world leaders can go and give speeches to the General Assembly. During his time at the General Assembly, he literally says something so controversial that all these world leaders start talking and they're not listening to him. He takes off his shoe, starts banging it on, like a gavel almost, on the podium to get their attention. And during his speech, he says, "We will bury you. Your children will be communists. You will be communists." I mean, he's pretty forceful in his rhetoric, okay? Kennedy has to have a stare down with Nikita Khrushchev. And for 13 days, we are not sure if we're going to nuclear war. And keep in mind what nuclear war is. If an atomic weapon goes off, like the ones that hit Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II, it's going to wipe out the downtown area. So in Cincinnati, it would wipe out the downtown area, okay? Certainly thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of lives would be lost in that attack. A nuclear bomb is multiple times more powerful. We'd be feeling a nuclear bomb. If it hit downtown Cincinnati, we'd be feeling it up here. If not for getting, a reaction to the blast itself, we'd definitely be getting radiation poisoning, possibly cancer over the long term. I mean, you're talking about a massive, massive explosion that's going to kill, over time at least, millions of people, okay? And that's how close we are. We are this close to pressing the button to starting World War III, which is going to be a nuclear war, okay? And like I said, the Russians had their list of targets. In this 13-day standoff, Kennedy, and Khrushchev thinks, oh, this little punk Kennedy, I can push him around. He's already screwed up with the Bay of Pigs. He's not a strong leader. And they've already had a couple of stare downs with the Berlin Wall, which was built in 1961 around West Berlin. They've already had this stare down before. Kennedy kind of won it because, yes, the Soviets built the Berlin Wall around West Berlin, okay, to try and isolate West Berlin. They succeeded in doing that. But Kennedy had the masterstroke of flying over to West Berlin and speaking to the people of Berlin in a speech where he basically said, "We're not going to forget you. You are our priority. We are not going to forget you. We're going to support you. And he finishes off the speech, by the way, the speech in West Berlin, with the dumbest statement any president has made because he didn't understand the language. He tried to finish off with a German phrase to, elicit support and camaraderie. He said, "Ich bin ein Berliner." Okay? As a free man, I say to all free men in the world, "Ich bin ein Berliner." He was trying to say, "I'm a Berliner too." Okay? It's a nice way of saying, "I'm one of you. I haven't forgotten you." The problem is that "Ich bin Berliner" is "I'm a Berliner." "Ich bin ein Berliner" is "I am a jelly donut." Think about Google Translate before there's Google Translate. It doesn't quite ring true.
Is that what you're talking about, jelly donuts and John F. Kennedy from Bomb Together?
Correct. Poor John F. Kennedy, for all time, he has the biggest gaffe in American politics. "I am a jelly donut." The West Berliners knew what he meant. It was one of those where it's like, yeah, okay, we know what you were trying to do. And they cheer him anyway. But somebody had to get fired for that one. That was pretty bad. Okay? Needless to say, Berlin Wall stays up until 1989. Okay? So it's there from 1961 to 1989 as a symbol of division between the East and West, of what Winston Churchill called the Iron Curtain. We legitimately have an Iron Curtain now in the form of the wall. It's a very, and this is why, look, when Donald Trump was talking about building a wall between the United States and Mexico, a lot of old people who remember, the Berlin Wall were against this. They didn't want a wall because for years we were fighting to bring this wall down, that it separated people, that it was a problem. So a lot of older people, my parents, one of my earliest memories of my parents is in 1989. I was about 8 years old, okay? And, 9 in 1989. And I remember when the Berlin Wall was coming down, I remember my mother crying, and I didn't understand why. And it was because all of her adult life, she had seen a wall in West Berlin separating people between capitalism and communism, between East versus West, and that symbol of hatred and misunderstanding and the Cold War was coming down. And people who hadn't seen each other for years, there were people that had not met their relatives at all because they were on a different side of the wall. They were meeting each other for the first time. They were hugging. The Germans were coming together. It was a symbolic end to the Cold War. And of course, Soviet Union falls the very next year. But the Berlin Wall, when it goes up in 61, is super tense. Well, now you're to the Cuban Missile Crisis, you're even more intense. Okay? And so when the Cuban Missile Crisis is going on, Khrushchev thinks, well, I can push this little punk Kennedy around. Kennedy stares him down. He puts a blockade around Cuba. He basically tells the United States Navy to encircle Cuba and not allow anybody in or out, which cuts off trade, and Cuba cannot survive without trade. They are not an island nation that is self-sufficient. They need outside trade desperately, otherwise people starve. So when we do that, it hurts Castro's regime. Castro then puts pressure on Khrushchev, says, look, I can't withstand this. I can't do this. You're going to have to resolve this. Khrushchev basically enters into negotiations at that point and says, all right, fine, if you eliminate your military bases in Turkey and in Greece, which were established during the Truman Doctrine, if you remember from your research, Harry S. Truman says that, in his speech that we have to help nations like Greece and Turkey to survive. So we're going to give them money, we're going to give them resources to make sure they don't fall to communism in exchange for military bases over there, which allows us to put missiles directed at the Soviet Union. Khrushchev says, hey, if you're nervous about us having missiles in Cuba, how about you remove the ones from Turkey and Greece? Kennedy goes, nah, we're good. We're going to keep our missiles there. You're going to remove yours. He's got the trump card. He's got a blockade around Cuba. He knows he can starve that island out. And sure enough, after 13 days of tense negotiations, the Soviets agree to remove the missiles. But during the entire Cold War, as Cody brought up, why is it a Cold War? This is the hottest it ever got. This is the closest we got to quite literally baking in a microwave. Okay? Now, Kennedy is not a warlike guy. He even puts in place organizations like the Peace Corps. This is another alternative way to to show American greatness during the Cold War. Kennedy comes up with this idea that, young people, when we say serve your country, when we say, hey, at the age of 18, we want you to go serve your country, what typically are we referring to? If you're going to serve your country. Military, right? Very good. Okay? Oh, you're going to go serve your country at the age of 18, you're going to join the military. Kennedy kind of views it as, what if we had an organization where you can serve your country, but in a peaceful way? And so he comes up with this idea that young people can basically sign up to go to a third world country, to go to a developing country that doesn't have the resources we do, doesn't have the economy we do, doesn't maybe have the same governmental policies that we do, but to go and live with these people and help these people to advance a little bit. So they get trained to dig irrigation ditches, to show them proper sanitation techniques, show them how to cook food properly, how to live more American, if you will. By doing so, and since they're doing it peaceful, you're spreading the values of America to other countries, you're displaying what a democracy can do, and you're kind of separating, do you want to go with communism, where these guys don't actually help you out, or do you want to go with the capitalist nation that actually gives you, some extra help and assistance, literally boots on the ground helping you, okay? So it's a way of spreading goodwill and American values throughout the globe without using a gun, okay? And the Peace Corps is still around. If you wanted to join, I had a student a few years ago who decided to join the Peace Corps. He's still in it. He loves doing it, okay? He's probably in his 30s at this point. But he's traveled the globe. He's gone to places that I never would travel to, but he is very much into it. And again, it's an organization to try and kind of spread American values and American ideals throughout the globe without using the military. Okay? During Kennedy's time, he has to deal with civil rights. Civil rights movement had already, the modern civil rights movement had already kicked off during the late 1940s with Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier in Major League Baseball, with Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, just to name a few things. There's of course Martin Luther King Jr. and his Montgomery bus boycott after Rosa Parks is asked to vacate a bus. So the modern civil rights movement was already very much in motion. But in 1963, they hold what is known as the March on Washington. This is where they are asking for more civil rights legislation, a striking down of Jim Crow laws. Brown versus the Board of Education was supposed to get rid of Jim Crow laws. It made them illegal, especially in school, okay? But a lot of these schools were very slow to desegregate. I don't know if you guys have ever seen the movie Remember the Titans, about T.C. Williams' football team in Virginia. Virginia is very close to D.C. It's almost north, it's on the border, okay? Yet T.C. Williams in 1970 finally integrates. So you're talking about 16 years after Brown versus the Board of Education, that school finally got with the times, and that was Virginia. So imagine what it's like down in the deep south, okay? Where maybe the federal government really didn't have as much control or as much say-so. So the March on Washington was very much over, hey, we need this civil rights stuff to be expedited. We're still getting African Americans prevented from voting. We're still getting African Americans prevented from economic opportunities and fair housing and things like that. So Martin Luther King Jr., amongst other civil rights leaders, organized the March on Washington. And they work with the Kennedy administration to make sure it's not too over the top. Literally, Kennedy looks at the leaders of this march and say, look, there's certain voices we probably don't want. We don't want fiery speakers. We don't want people that are going to get this group all riled up, because they're worried about this march turning into a riot. What happens if on the streets of D.C. these people get whipped up into a frenzy and decide to go burn some things, or decide to go, for God's sakes, what happened on January 6th? What if they descend upon the Capitol building and demand their rights right now? So they were telling people like Malcolm X, they were telling people like James Baldwin, who was a famous essayist and writer of the time, that we don't want them to talk at the March on Washington because they're pretty fiery. They instead said, here's the list of people that are okay, and they culminated with MLK. And if you've heard his I Have a Dream speech, it's very peaceful, okay? It's very idealistic. It's, very impassioned, still a great amount of passion, but he wants people to be peaceful. He wants people to get along. So not surprising, the March on Washington is known mostly for the I Have a Dream speech. But it is a much larger event. There are a lot of speakers, there are a lot of different events happening, and it's really a protest to tell the people in Congress to wake up and start doing something. And so they start working on a civil rights bill that unfortunately John F. Kennedy does not outlive. John F. Kennedy does not live to see it happen. Now, another goal is getting to the moon. John F. Kennedy, out of nowhere, during a time when we are falling behind the Soviets in everything in the space race, all of a sudden out of nowhere decides that we're going to the moon. We have not caught up in space technology with the Russians. The Russians had already put Sputnik and Sputnik 2 and a whole host of other satellites out into orbit. They had put the first man in space. And had him orbit around the globe. They had beaten us to every single thing. Now why? The Russians really didn't care if people got hurt. Yuri Gagarin, the first human to ever go into space, they didn't really know if they were going to be able to get him back. It's almost by luck that he managed to come back. They weren't really 100% sure because that culture, they really didn't care. Hey, if you died in the process, oh well. Elon Musk just got into trouble because he said that in order to go to Mars, people are going to probably die. And people said, what? And he was like, no, space exploration, people have died all the time. And, there are people out there saying, shouldn't you, make sure that these people are not going to die? Shouldn't you take every possible route, to avoid that? And he was like, look at the history of the space race, people died. And there are Americans that did die during the space race, okay? So, again, we're a little behind, but all of a sudden, out of nowhere, Kennedy said, I'm going to make it the job of this government before the decade is out to put a man on the moon. So we're going to beat the Russians to the moon. The Russians may have gotten to space first, but we're going to get to the moon first. People at NASA kind of looked at him and said, really? We can barely figure out how to get out of the Earth's gravitational pull, let alone get out to the moon. But that was the goal. He set the goal. And the Apollo program was the mission or the program that was assigned the task to get to the moon. Okay? It did not start off well. Apollo 1, during its test phase, they were literally testing the mission. They were going through a final practice run. The capsule had a fire that killed 3 astronauts. Okay, 3 astronauts perished on the launch pad before they ever even got a chance to go to space. So not exactly the most triumphant of events, but by 1968, end of 1968, Apollo 8 manages to get around the moon. Okay, they circle the moon, come back home safely, and then by July of 1969, we put a man on the moon, an Ohioan. Who was the first man on the moon? Neil Armstrong, who famously says, that's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Okay? But the Apollo program was this mission to the moon, started by Kennedy. Again, Kennedy doesn't live to see it happen. Okay? All of this stuff was part of what he called the New Frontier. Now, why does that matter? If you remember, all the way through American history, we've talked about how the frontier is the next land. It's always been land. Okay? That, we're going to go out to the frontier. The frontier was Kentucky back in the late 1700s, and the frontier was like Kansas in the mid-1800s, and it was California. Well, once we kind of conquered that, we start imperialism. Well, the new frontier is now Alaska, it's Guam, it's Puerto Rico. And then the new frontier is, well, we're going to be more diplomatic and start getting involved in other countries. We're going to get involved in World War II, we're going to get involved in Vietnam, we're going to get involved in Korea. His version of the new frontier is we're going to the next frontier, the space, okay? As they call it in Star Trek, the final frontier, okay? That we're going to go explore space, okay? In Kennedy's vision, it's the next challenge for America. It doesn't have to be anything specific. We're going to tackle challenges and think about what he's always doing here. We're going to find alternative methods to handle these problems. There's a problem with the Soviet Union. Well, let's try and figure out a way that doesn't involve war. You know, there's a problem with the perception of the United States. Well, let's have a Peace Corps. Let's try and change the narrative. So this is why Kennedy is fondly remembered. Now, you have to understand, he was going to be in a very big fight in 1964 to get reelected. He was not exactly a very popular president, especially with older Americans. So in 1963, November of 1963, he decides to launch his presidential campaign. Anybody know where he launches his presidential campaign? Specific city. Anybody know what November 22nd, 1963 is? The assassination of Kennedy. Anybody know where it happened? Nobody knows it happens in Dallas, Texas? Okay, he decides to go to Texas because Texas is a swing state back then. And his vice president is a guy named Lyndon Baines Johnson, who's from Texas. So he thinks, all right, I'm going to go to Lyndon's territory. Lyndon's people don't particularly care for me because Texas is upset about my civil rights stances. So I'm going to try and go there and at least get my kickoff going to make sure Texas understands that I'm still listening to him. So he goes to Dallas, Texas. He goes with Lyndon Baines Johnson. Johnson is with him. So too is the governor. Like, this is going to be a big parade down the streets of Dallas, Texas. This is talked about for weeks in advance. This is the first step in his road to victory in 1964. He goes there with his wife. They get into the motorcade. They're driving through Dallas, Texas, waving to crowds. As they're driving by this Texas School Book Depository, shots ring out from the 6th floor. Kennedy is shot in the neck. He's shot in the top of the head. He's basically dead before he ever, they declare him dead at the hospital, but he's already dead. Okay? He gets shot right in front of his wife. One of the bullets actually ricochets and hits the governor in the arm. Okay? They race to the hospital. Of course, he's declared dead. Lyndon Baines Johnson has to take the oath of office on the plane ride on the way back to Washington, D.C. with the dead president in the next cabin. Okay? In his coffin. If you ever see, I don't know if you guys have seen have you seen the picture of Lyndon Baines Johnson getting sworn in? Okay, this is the actual image. Lyndon Baines Johnson taking the oath of office. He's actually on Air Force One. Jackie Kennedy is standing next to him. Anybody know why that is such a disturbing image? Yeah.
I heard it was like a dude winking at him.
Well, it's a disturbing image. That's the dress she was wearing when her husband was shot and killed. She literally has brain matter on her dress, blood, other things. Her husband was shot right in front of her. She didn't have time to change her clothes or anything, and she didn't have a change of clothes. They're going to fly back, to Washington, D.C. So she's literally standing there with her husband's blood on her while he's taking the oath of office. LBJ made the decision to do it on Air Force One because he wanted to make sure the American people knew exactly who was in charge, that the government had not changed, that it was going to continue. Now, to LBJ's credit, he viewed the year, the 1963 to 64 year, as being the end of Kennedy's term, that this was not LBJ's term. So not surprisingly, after Kennedy's assassination in November of 1963, which by the way is a turning point moment, because think about what Kennedy has always said. This is the new frontier, this is the young people, this is the youth movement, and now you're going back to an old guy. Like that, you're going back to an old guy. Okay? LBJ at least does continue Kennedy's progress here. He said, look, Kennedy made a promise to Martin Luther King Jr. that substantive civil rights legislation would be passed. And so he dumped all of his time and energy and effort into the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So while Kennedy may not have seen it happen, civil rights did occur. Civil Rights Act of 1964, and then he even parlays it into an even bigger act the next year after he's reelected with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Civil Rights Act of 1964 basically enforced the 14th Amendment, that African Americans are citizens and therefore given all rights and freedoms and equal protection under the law extended to all citizens, regardless of race, color, creed, whatever else. You are going to be protected, which means you're going to get fair housing, you're going to get fair treatment when it comes to the workforce, you're going to get your right to vote, you're going to get your right to serve in the military, you're going to get equal rights and equal protection under the law. 1965's Voting Rights Act basically made it illegal for poll taxes to exist, made it illegal for, you didn't have to pass a reading test, a literacy test to vote. It made it illegal for all of the barriers that African Americans had had to deal with in regards to voting. Those barriers basically disappeared. All that was LBJ, which then parlays his push for what he calls the Great Society, which is where we're going to end for the day. For those people at home, I will be back with this group here later on this week, where we will go through Johnson and Nixon.